Well, first, let me just talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about. And Jack, I'm going to steal your sheet here. Sorry. We just sang this song, Make Room. And I think we talk about this occasionally. Worship is something that can be really passive, right? We come in here and the music's playing. And for a small church, small team, I think we've got a great worship experience. But we can just kind of sing the songs or not sing and just not think about it, not be engaged with other parts of ourselves. And yet that isn't the heart of worship, right? This is something that we do. It's an opportunity to interact with God and to give God. This is just like an Old Testament sacrifice of slaughtering a lamb or offering a dove or grain or whatever, or giving our tithes and offering. We offer worship to God. And yet we can come in here and just not think about it at all. And yet I know there are people who came here with burdens, right? You have things on your heart. And maybe you didn't sing at all, maybe you did, but you just didn't really engage with it. There are things weighing on you, decisions to make, wounded relationships, mistakes you made, right? That's just in your personal life. And then if you have a family, which we all do on some level, right? You're worried about them. And then you're worried about stuff in the cross. And then you're worried about upcoming election. And then you're thinking about Ukraine and Palestine. I just found out this morning North Korea is making weapons that are being used in Ukraine. That's a fun problem, right? There's so many things that we come here worried about, stressed about, concerned about. We just sang this. Here's where I lay it down, every burden, every crown, every lie, every doubt, and I make room for you. And that's what this series is about. I was very glad when Esther chose this song for this series. That's what this is about, is me coming here and saying, God, I've got this thing that I'm worried about. I'm kind of mad at you about. Because of this, I don't believe in you anymore. And that's one of the things we do often is like, I don't believe in you, and yet we still argue with them, right? So who are you talking to when you say, I don't believe in you, right? We do that. And so we come here and we say, Lord, this is upsetting, this is troublesome, this has got me depressed, this has got me hopeless, this has taken my purpose, this is whatever, and I'm giving it to you, and I want you to do something with it. That's what we just sang, right? And that's what we're talking about in this series. How can I make room for God to do something in me or through me? And that's what we have to be open to. It can be one of maybe multiple options, but certainly two. Sometimes it's fix that. Sometimes it's fix me, because, right? Sometimes it's me. Now, I'm not making nukes or warheads in North Korea, so I'm not the fault of that. But maybe I've contributed to other kinds of problems, and I have to be open for God to work in me. So when we sing these songs, I encourage you to not be passive, to be engaged, right? To think about it, and to try to do that. Lord, and you can be like, I don't know how to do that. So Lord, I don't know how to make room for you. I don't know how to give you this stuff. So I'm going to try and give you these things, and I'm going to try to be open for you to do something, right? That's what we're singing about, and I encourage you to do that as we go into this series, as we continue in this. So let me just pray. Lord, I thank you. There is so much bad news in our hearts, in our world, and yet this is the world that you made perfectly, and the world that you entered into to show us a better way, so we can live like you, so we can have this abundant life that you promised, so your kingdom can be more fully realized here and now while we wait for it to be completed. Lord, there's so much grace in that. There's so much presence in that. There's so much mystery and love in that, and so we just thank you. And so I just give you these next few minutes. I pray you'd speak to me, help me to be changed, and I pray you'd speak through me so we can hear what you have for us today. In your name, amen. Well, thank you so much for being here and for celebrating this major milestone of figuring out how to do communion without getting into fights, right? There was a church planter in Michigan years and years ago, and their church just blew up. Within a few years, there are 10,000 people, so we're not quite on that plan yet. But they were getting in traffic jams as they're leaving the parking lot, and they're like yelling at each other and swearing at each other. And so the pastor one day like stop doing that. And if you can't stop doing that, stop coming because you're making us all look bad. Like don't do that. So we haven't gotten there. So good job. So today we continue in our practicing the way portion of this series. And we're talking about various spiritual disciplines or practices that God has for us. And I was talking with a friend of mine, another pastor, and he's like, well, are you using, there's a relatively new book by John Mark Comer, is that his name? That is called Practicing the Way. And I knew that book was coming out and then forgot about it. And Michelle said, what do you want to call this section, this half of the series? I was like, well, just put Practicing on the front of the way, we'll be done. And for some, if you've read the book, it might look like I have not read the book, so I'm not stealing from him. So if you're, it's very important not plagiarize. So I want to say that. This is where we're talking about things that we can do to help us be available for God, to change us, to make us more like Him, to give us this abundant life so His kingdom can be fully realized. Today we're talking about 3 super fun things. So you're stuck here. Like you can't, if you walk out now, we're going to know. We're talking about abstaining, frugality, and sacrifice. Which I don't know if those are the right tenses, but abstinence or abstaining, frugality, and sacrifice. Those are the 3 things that we're going to talk about. It's going to be great, right? Yay, church. The first one, abstaining. In this context, in churches, we often think of abstaining as or abstinence as referring to only things like sex and alcohol. And it is that, right? There are conversations about those topics to be had, but it's much more than that. Here's a verse from 1 Peter 2:11. Peter, if you don't know, was the leader of the apostles. So there's like the 12, and for some reason, so Jesus chose 12, and then he had 3 that were key leaders, and Peter was the top dog among those 3. And then he was one of the main leaders of the new church. Got a lot of stuff wrong, but Jesus chose him. And so when Peter writes and talks, you kind of listen, right? Because he was the guy that spent the most one-on-one time with Jesus. And while he didn't get Jesus fully, it was the women who got Jesus. So guys, we need to remember that. The women who still seem to get Jesus better than guys. Peter was the one charged. So when Peter writes this stuff, like he's writing from a place of experience, right? And he says this, "Beloved," he's writing to the church, "I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul." So abstain from these things. Well, why does my personal life matter, right? Like, who are you, Peter, to reach into my home, into my personal life? It isn't just what I believe, right? Just if I believe the right things, if I sign the right documents, and I check all the right doctrinal points, isn't that good enough? Like, who are you, Peter, to speak to that? Why does my private life matter? Because it bears witness to God's character and his ability to change people. The next verse says this, "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles." So in this context, Gentiles would be non-believers, people who aren't Christians, people who don't believe in Jesus. "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." Let your life that has been changed by Jesus bear witness to who God is and his greatness. Keep your behavior honorable so the people around you, the people who don't believe in Jesus, the people who think Jesus is a joke, can say, your life is different. Why? Well, because of Jesus. This same friend that I was talking to about the series, he's a pastor, and he was talking about a family that he's helping with. They have a daughter who's in trouble, and he was kind of helping her. One of the challenges are helping them help her. And one of the challenges she has, and they have with her, is she lies a lot. And if you've ever known or have been a liar, people who lie a lot, it's like a lot of it's just like dumb lies, like about the dumbest things. And then it snowballs, and it's really hard to keep all the plates spinning. And what did I say? And then there's always holes in the lie, right? And so they try to patch those holes, meanwhile, you have people who love you the most are trying to help you and can't. They never know what they're dealing with. And Nate said, well, for him, it was interesting because when he was in high school, in middle school, he was a big liar. And again, dumb stuff. And it just snowballed and snowballed. And so I was talking to him about it. I said, well, what changed? How did you stop? What was the difference? In his response, and Nate is super bright and super articulate. He says, Jesus. It's one word. I've talked before. There's plenty of addiction on both sides of my family. Why am I not under the burden of that? It's Jesus. There's so many other things in my life that haven't come to fruition. It's because of Jesus. It's one word, right? And so our testimony of how God has changed us is what can make Jesus attractive to people who think he's a joke. So how we live matters. How we live matters. So that they'll see our good deeds, our changed life, and they'll glorify God when he comes back. They will join us in heaven in this fully completed, realized kingdom that Jesus is talking about. So it is about sex and alcohol and stuff like that, but it's more than that. We talked about fasting last week. Fasting is a form of this discipline, a form of abstaining. The term kind of implies a temporary pause on something that may be perfectly acceptable. I might abstain from something that is bad, or I might abstain for a while from something that is good, just for a moment. Many of the things we might abstain from are good for us, like food. Food is good for us. Food is enjoyable. We need food to live, but we might fast for a little while for a specific purpose. We talked about some of the reasons why Jesus fasted. Before he chose the disciples, he spent the whole night praying and fasting, so he made sure he was in the right place to hear from God and make the right decisions. If Jesus needed to fast, so he made good decisions, I think it's a good tip for us, right? Like maybe, we should too. Sometimes it's a good thing that has taken too large of a share of our heart or our resources or our time. So these things we fast from sometimes are good things that have just taken up too much of ourselves. Here's a quote. If we feel that any habit or pursuit harmless in itself is keeping us from God and sinking us deeper in the things of earth, if we find that things which others can do with impunity are for us the occasion of falling, then abstinence is our only course. Abstinence alone can recover for us the real value of what should have been for our help, but which has become an occasion of falling. It is necessary that we should steadily resolve to give up anything that comes between ourselves and God. There are sometimes good things that become bad things. In fasting or abstinence provides a reset. We get to reset on that and put it in its right place. Now, I've worked with young people for a long time, and we've talked about a lot of struggles, personal struggles that people are having. How do I deal with this? And sometimes it's stuff that is bad, like you just need to not do that thing. And sometimes it is maybe a relatively good thing, an okay thing, a fine thing, but it's taken on too much of a share of your heart. And so the verse that I often reflect on is in 1 Timothy. It says this, 1 Timothy 1:8. Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient. So here's how I've used this verse with people that are struggling with some imbalance. I'll say, well, the law is for the lawless, and this part of your life is out of control. So we're going to implement some laws that will help you get control of that. So it may be alcohol, it may be social media. Sometimes it's music. I'm listening to a lot. Music is great, right? I love music. I can't talk to someone without quickly. Most of you have heard a reference to a song or a band in a conversation with me. Like, I can't help it. It just comes up, and these songs just stick to my brain, and I love music. I'm like a frustrated musician. We went to Dave's guitar shop yesterday. If I had a $3,000 guitar, I would be much better, and I would practice a lot more, right? That's just simple math. Buy me the expensive guitar. In fact, buy me several, and I'll hang them up, and they'll be gorgeous, and then I'm going to rock your faces off. It's going to be awesome. No, the fact is I'm not that guy. I'm a frustrated musician, but I love music. I love talking about it. But the fact is, and I'm a lyric guy. So I remember a friend of mine growing up, his family were all brilliant, the Stargarts. We're all brilliant people, all talented people, great musicians. And Matt was my closest friend in that family. We were lyric people. So back then, you'd buy a cassette tape, the good old days, and it would come with these, big, you'd open it up and you'd read the lyrics. CD cases had those. I would read the lyrics before I listened to the whole album. I love lyrics. Michelle's different. She's better with lyrics, but she really cares more about the melody and the sound, which is why she's wrong. I love lyrics, and Matt was kind of a lyric guy. He comes home, and his brother and dad are listening to some 80s hard rock band that was full of awful subject matter, and they're like, this is amazing. Listen to the timing. Listen to the chord changes. It's incredible. And Matt's like, this is awful. You can't listen to this. They had no idea what it was about. Sometimes music can take too much of a share of our hearts, and sometimes the lyrical content, the musical content, can also be a drag, right? It can bring us down. It fills our hearts and minds with things that aren't good for us, and it's not their fault, it's not the musician's fault why we might engage in those behaviors, but we begin to realize that, hey, this isn't good for me. When I was in college, I think I was probably actually depressed. I didn't know it until afterwards. And I was into a band. Some of you have probably not, most of you haven't heard of a band called Toad the Wet Sprocket. Anyone? Right? Yes, thank you. They were great, kind of the folk rock band of the 90s. But there was an album that I loved. Didn't listen to it for a few years, and then I was a hall director, and one of my RAs was into the same band, and they were the inspiration for Jars of Clay. Those guys bonded around, they loved the same band, and so they started Jars of Clay. Talking about Toad the Wet Sprocket was one of their inspirations. Well, I put in this album, and I immediately felt so dark and heavy. It took me back, 5 years earlier of how just depressed I was and how alone I felt. And I was very close just walking away from the Lord, and I went back. Now, I can listen to that album now, but that was like, I can't listen to this for a while. Like, this is taking me to a place I don't want to go. So you implement a law. I'm not going to listen to, no one should ever listen to country music, so we can just agree on that. But you might say, I'm not going to listen to music that has this kind of lyrical content. It might be a big group, like it's like music by non-Christian artists. I'm not going to listen to. I'm going to listen to only Christian music because I know the lyrical content will be uplifting. Maybe that's what you do for a while, so that the music no longer is putting those images or those ideas or that mood into your heart. That might be something you do. I mentioned last week that Michelle and I were as ministers in the Assemblies of God, we can't drink alcohol. That's an old rule. Eventually it will change. But the heart of that, and people say, well, that's silly. The heart of it is this. In the early days of the Assemblies of God, there was revival. And people were going to church every day, and they're having people are getting saved and seeing amazing things. And sure, some of the stuff was weird, and some of it might have been a little bit off, but for most of those people, most of the time, their heart was right. They really wanted to experience what God had for them. So they wouldn't go to the ball game, they'd go to church. They wouldn't go to out to drink or go to the bar, they'd go to church, which became good Christians go to church, bad Christians or serious Christians go to church, non-serious Christians go to the ball game, don't go to the movie, whatever, which became going to the ball game or the movie is bad, and alcohol became an issue because, well, it dulls the senses, which is which is true, right? Which is part of why it's fun. But is also part of why so many dumb things are associated with alcohol, right? So they said, well, I don't want to drink and then not be open to what God has for me. So they said, we're not going to drink. So that was the reason why I did it. I don't want to, it became a law unto itself, and so it got misappropriated, but that was the heart behind it. So sometimes we take something and say, this is bad for me, and I can't get control of it, so I'm just going to cut that part off so I can build other parts of myself up, so then maybe I can handle that. Maybe I never return to that, but we abstain from some things so that they can be put into our right place. Money is another thing. It might be like my spending is out of control, and so I'm just not going to buy any new clothes for a year. So I'll go stock up on new underwear, and then, right? And I'm not going to buy any new clothes for a year. It'd be impossible for most people to not buy anything for a year, but I'm not going to buy new clothes for a year. Some of you have done it with social media. I mentioned that. Maybe it's because you're just scrolling your life away. Maybe it's because you recognize that social media, you get onto that and pretty quickly you're into sites that you shouldn't be on, that are bad for you. So because you can't stop that flow, you just cut it off entirely. So I make a law, I'm not going to be on social media because I can't right now in myself avoid going into dark places or wasting time or just filling my head with nonsense. Isn't a little nonsense good? Sure, it's good to laugh. Is a day full of nonsense good? Probably not, right? Day after day, definitely not. So some of you have said, I'm going to go on a social media fast. I'm just going to cut that off. The point is that the discipline of abstinence is not just about things that are bad for us or ungodly. In our fallen world and broken hearts, even good things can get out of whack. I don't really ascribe to much of Reformed theology. I think there's some good contributions. There's some really dark contributions to that. But what I like the idea of, like, God has called us into the world to reclaim things for him. I love that idea. As we bring his kingdom here, we don't just say, well, there's a lot of bad music, so we're just not going to play music anymore. No, we're told to write a new song, right? Music is in our hearts. It is in God's heart. Like, as we are his children, made in his image, it means God likes music. So many people, every culture has its form of music, right? So we don't say, well, music can be bad, so we're not going to do music. No, we're going to reclaim music. And so if you were around in the 60s and 70s, thank God for people like Larry Norman and Keith Green and all these people said, no, we're going to reclaim rock music and folk music and all this stuff. And we're going to try to make good music because this is a gift from God, right? So it isn't necessarily about bad things. Sometimes it's about reclaiming good things. Good things can get out of whack. But abstinence helps us reset ourselves on God. He is the source of our life and our breath and our joy. Abstaining from certain good things and bad things can help us put our trust for validation, purpose, and meaning and happiness back on him. I'm going to pause on that so I can focus on you. So that's abstinence. Frugality. In the face of a world and a culture that elevates extravagance and opulence, frugality offers another chance to reset our values. It's similar to some forms of abstaining, but it's more of a lifestyle. The Bible has many warnings for the wealthy and the rest of us who are tempted to court them in place of those with less. Here's some verses from James. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? And then in James 5, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. You have lived on the earth and in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. So James is addressing some specific issues, some specific problems in their culture that had also been affecting the church, because that is a constant and ongoing struggle. Every church, every group of Christians is a reflection to some degree of their culture. So church here can look very different in churches in other parts of the world because their cultures are different. I once was talking to some friends who are longtime missionaries in China. And I was saying, gosh, it must be so different in church there because they're just so grateful for the chance to meet. They're so grateful for the gospel. And assuming that and they're persecuted. The true church in China is persecuted still, assuming that they must therefore be just better than us, right? He says, well, no. One time there were two Chinese pastors that were in a fight, and so one of them punched the other pastor's wife in the face. Like, okay, so we're all jerks. Yeah, we're all jerks. We're all in need of grace and reformation and change. But all churches, all people are affected by their culture. So while James is dealing with some specific things, we have to turn the spotlight back on ourselves. Back then, the wealthy were able to take advantage of the poor. That's been fixed, right? Nope, it hasn't, right? We still do this. Maybe not to these extremes and maybe not as out front, but it still happens. So when we read these passages that say things like calling out the wealthy, it's very easy to say, well, that's not talking about me. That's bad practice. That's bad theology, okay? I encourage you to always at least be open to how you might be in that text, how you might be what James is talking about. Are you talking to me here? How does this relate to me? And maybe you aren't wealthy, maybe you aren't this that he's talking about, but it's all relative, right? When we ask the question, who is relative, or who is wealthy, it's all relative. There is a wealthiest person in this room. There's a wealthiest person in this building. There's a wealthiest person in North La Crosse and in the greater La Crosse area and in the U.S. and in the world. It's all relative, right? But the fact is, globally speaking, we all are. We are all wealthy. If you drove here, you're wealthy. Most people on the planet don't own a car. They don't. So if you own a car, you're wealthy. If you have 2 cars, and especially if you've got a garage for both of those cars, you are globally speaking super rich. Right? I'm not trying to shame you for having 2 cars. We have 2 cars. What I'm trying to say is we have to read ourselves into the text and ask, are you talking to me? What does this mean for me? What does this mean about me? And what does this mean about the people I support versus the people I don't support? Frugality is a discipline. This is not meant to condemn us or to condemn myself for having resources. We need resources. Resources are God-given, right? We need money, we need food, we need shelter, all those things. Abraham Maslow is right. We have a hierarchy of needs. We have things that we need to live, and those are God-given. There's nothing wrong with wanting a home for your family and all that stuff, but we need to make sure we don't read ourselves out of these hard texts, these uncomfortable texts. Frugality provides an opportunity for me to inventory. Am I being generous? Have I reserved enough of my resources so I can be generous? Does my generosity hurt a little? Is it a sacrifice or is it convenient? If you've grown up, if you've been a Christian for a very long time, I'm not going to name names, but you know who you are. You've been around enough to have missionaries come through churches, and many, when we were fundraising for Bluffs, I visited a few churches just throughout Wisconsin. It was great. And you'd be surprised, there's a ton of little churches and little towns that are full of mostly people who are 50, 55, 60 and older. A lot of gray hair, not a lot of people sitting in those pews, but contributing thousands a year to missions. Justin, right? Like you go, we don't have them yet, but you go and at least in our fellowship, there's a practice of having pictures on the wall of missionaries, Chi Alpha, Teen Challenges, whatever that you support. And there's different versions of that. And sometimes you go into these, and there's like 100 people up on the wall that they've been sorting, and not for supporting, but not just for $5 or $10 a month. It's like sometimes $25, $50, $100 a month, and there's a bunch of them. Some of those people also support missions personally. So they give to the church missions church budget, which you can do here at Bluffs. It's a way you can give tithes, and also you can give to missions, and we pool that and send them to missionaries. But so they give to the church missions budget, and they give personally. And it's incredible. I mean, it's incredible the amount of work that is being funded around the world by people who are just doing what you do. You just give. It's just what you do. And that's awesome. When I was a missions pastor, that's what I did before coming here, is my role at Real Life. I began to realize, well, that's great. It can also be kind of passive. This is something I do, and so I disengage my heart a little bit from it. It's just something we write the check and just kind of go through. I don't even think about it. And that's part of why missionaries say, hey, we certainly need your money to go, to buy the plane tickets, to do the projects overseas, but we also need your prayers, right? And so please pray for us. And I've shared some stories about that. They feel that in real time, so please pray for us. But our frugality allows me to ask the question, is my sacrifice convenient or not? Does it hurt a little bit or not? Living frugally for a time permits me to think about my money and to create space for an opportunity for generosity. How might this look? Here's how it looks, an example of how it looks for me. I ask the question, so often we'll say, I need to go to the store to buy X. And so I'll say, do I need that? Like, I need is a big word. And I got that because when I was in grad school, I was working with adults with the development disabilities. It was a day program, so we'd go pick them up from home. Some were very low functioning, and we would bring them back to work, and they would do tasks, and they would earn some money, and we'd teach them life skills and stuff like that. And I bought a laptop. And back then, it was like, what was it, 95, 96, I bought a laptop. It was like $1,000, which would be an awesome computer comparatively to then. But I bought this computer, and I was very excited about it. It was my first computer. Back then, not everybody had a computer. It just wasn't normal for every home to have a computer, or certainly multiple ones. My first computer, and I was talking to a colleague, said, yeah, I bought a computer. Why'd you buy a computer? Well, I need it for school. And her response was, you need it? And I don't even remember her name. I didn't know her super well. She lived with a bunch of people in a house where they kept the temperature like 50 degrees year round. I mean, they lived as cheaply as possible. So it's really hard to kind of win a I need kind of argument with her. But it stuck with me. Do I need this? My friend Nate, again, this is the third reference in one sermon with him. I've had this conversation. Annie and I just talked about this. A lot of the running I do is really oriented towards running to raising money for others, right? And I'm honored to be able to do that. The more you run, the more shoes you have to buy, and they get expensive fast, right? And the gear for this very inexpensive sport can become expensive. And that becomes like a bit of an irony for me. I'm spending a bunch of money so I can raise money for people who have nothing. That I get a little torn up inside about that. Like, is this right? So for me, do I need it? And do I need it now? Can I wait? And so I'll often wait to see if I still feel like I need it in a few months. Some things you need to buy. Buying things is not the issue. This allows me, trying to live frugally allows me to check. Like, do I need this? Am I spending my resources with a kingdom mindset or not? I mentioned not buying clothes for a year. One of the issues, this is going to bug some of you, I'm sorry. We have a dog that loves me, does not know that I don't love her, but I've told her. I have a problem with the amount of money we spend on our dogs, our pets. I do. When we go, and we have this conversation often, Michelle will want to buy stuff, and I'm like, I can't handle buying something that she's going to tear up in seconds, is going to go away. It's like what we could also just go out and, next time we start a fire in the fireplace, we'll just use cash to start it. Like, it feels the same way. It does. So I asked is it wrong to having a pet seems also to be written on our hearts. It is a pretty universal thing. And very, very, very poor people, you see it around town sometimes, homeless people having a dog, right? Having a pet seems to be given to us. Animals can be incredible companions. I'm not saying we shouldn't have pets. But I ask myself often, are we spending as much money on disadvantaged children as we are on our dog? Chick-fil-A has a series of commercials, right? God bless Chick-fil-A. And one of them is about this, it's the series of commercials where people talk about, they go repeatedly, and then the Chick-fil-A store did this thing to kind of bless them, right? One of them is this young woman who would, every time she took her dog for chemo, she would go to Chick-fil-A. And then finally, when the chemo was done, they threw a party for the dog. I think chemo for a dog is wrong. I do. I'm sorry. You don't have to agree with me. But the heart of frugality in a globally minded heart tells me there are people, I need to ask myself, am I giving to the world's needs, the needs of people, as much as I am to my dog? And it isn't to say, well, I can spend $5,000 on chemo for our dog, so I'm going to get $5,000 to missions. That isn't the question. We have to ask ourselves, and living frugally and abstaining allows me to check myself and make sure I'm investing my resources appropriately. We can disagree on pets, but I think we need to ask the question. Ask the question, the resources I have and how I'm spending them, is this with a kingdom mindset or not? Taking some time to abstain from certain kinds of purchases maybe, or living frugally for a year. I'm going to spend the next year living as frugally as possible, allows me to see what resources I have, and allows me to look at them, how I'm spending them from another window. God does want us to enjoy life. He made the world, and he made it so we can enjoy it. This should be an awesome and blessed life. It should be. This should be fun. Jesus describes the kingdom of God as what? A party, right? You're invited to the party. You don't want to come, you're invited to the party. He wants people to come to the party. I love C.S. Lewis's in the last book of the Narnia Chronicles when he describes heaven. It's this unending land, and children are just running over hill after hill after hill. It doesn't end. It's full of freedom and grace and love to party. God wants us, his kingdom here now. His kingdom, his church should look like a party. Sometimes a tea party, sometimes a meeting. We should have parties. At the same time, we need to make sure that we take time, give time to check ourselves, right? And these kinds of disciplines allow us to do that. Principles like tithes and offerings are practices that help us practice generosity and gratefulness. Frugality gives us space to make sure our hearts are in it. Dallas Willard wrote this. Frugality frees us from concern and involvement with the multitude of desires that would make it impossible for us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. In Micah, he says, I don't want sacrifices, this is what I want. You do all that stuff, that's not ever what I wanted. So he looking backwards at the Mosaic law and all that practices. That was to get you started, but that wasn't what it was about. What was it about? It was about this stuff. Doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with your God. Frugality allows us to do that. Last discipline of the day, sacrifice. This is giving. Not from our extra, but from what we depend on. Luke 21. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, which is good. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live. 2 small copper coins. These are Greek lepta. A lepton was a Jewish bronze or copper coin worth about 1/128th of a day's wages. Anyone ever use that to kind of factor? I used to do this when I was a kid, making $3.35 an hour. I got a raise up to minimum wage once. I was working at a pizza place. You've been doing a good job. We're going to give you a raise. So we're now going to make you a legal employee that we can report. Back then, cassette tapes were about $10. My way of estimating the value of my time was in terms of music, cassettes. So if I do this for 3 hours, it's worth a tape. Or if I buy this instead of that would cost me 2 tapes. I'd rather have the music. So everything was in terms of music. My first tape, I think, was the Go-Go's, which I still stand by because they rock. The bass lines are awesome. 1/128th of a denarius was what this lepta was. The denarius was about a day's wages. So she gave about 6 minutes worth of wage, which for today, if you make $20 an hour, you make $160 per day, the value would be about $2.50. So all she had would be like all you only having $2.50. That's what she gave, and she gave all. Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac. Then all his hope was in Isaac. Hebrews 11 tells us that he was counting on God resurrecting him from the dead, but he was asked to give everything. Elijah asked the widow to make him some food, even though she had only enough for one more meal for her and her son. Does this mean we should all empty our bank accounts? No. Proverbs tells us to save money for the future. We are to live wisely. At the same time, not burdened by our money or not trusting ourselves more than we trust God. Philippians 2 says this, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus is our example. This whole series is how do we follow him. Jesus is up in heaven where everything is perfect and ideal, love and peace and freedom. And he made the world for us, because the Bible says they and him, it's like a mixture of who made the world. But God makes the world for us to enjoy, and then we wrecked it. Right? We did. That's the story. And you say, well, Adam and Eve did it. And yeah, and I do it too. And you do it too, right? We continue to wreck Eden. Our brokenness still affects the people in the world around us. This is true. So Jesus, recognizing this, out of his love, gave up everything to come and live with us and to walk around with us. And when you walked around then, you got literal animal feces on your feet. So when he washed the disciples' feet, when he washed Judas's feet, shortly before he betrayed him, knowing he betrayed him, he was washing crap off his feet, literal and figurative, right? Jesus came and gave up everything, all that he had, for us. That's the example we follow. That's an insanely, ridiculously, amazing, miraculously high standard, right? So does Jesus call you to be him? No, but Paul even says, I would go to hell that you would know Jesus, right? We're called to a different kind of life. And these practices of abstaining, frugality, and sacrifice help us see, like, am I living that life? Am I willing? We had missionaries to Libya here, and they're often, as they're traveling around, people say, I couldn't do what you do. And Natalie, who is a dear friend and a wonderful woman, she's like, really? You couldn't do that? If Jesus, who did all that for you, asked you to do something, you couldn't do it? Jesus did everything for you, and he calls us to do that. Now, you might say, I can't do, that's not where I'm at right now. I understand that. We sang make room. Lord, I don't know I can give everything, but I want to give more. I want to be more like you. So I want to give you this part of my life. I want to trust you with that. That widow's mite is both, I think it's that coupled with like the mustard seed faith. Like Jesus just wants a little bit. It's all he needs is a little bit of us. He invites us to the party. We come, we sample the appetizers. Like, oh, that's pretty good, right? And then we sit down. We kind of figure out how's the crowd work. We slowly merge into the party that he's creating for us, that he's throwing for us. This better life. We trust him a little bit. He builds on that. For us, moving here was a great risk. We know what it's like to risk a lot. Dallas Willard, who I've taken a lot from this series and quoted this morning, he tells a story when he was in grad school. Willard writes incredible spiritual literature, but he's a math teacher, so it's like doesn't make sense at all. Right? He's a brilliant guy, teaches at Southern California, I think. Brilliant guy, did his PhD at Madison, which I always think directionally, which is that way, right? Madison. In grad school, when you're full-time in grad school and that's what you're doing, you don't have a lot, typically. If your job is to be a student, even if you're getting scholarships, you don't have a lot. Well, challenged to live sacrificially, they began a practice. I don't know how long they did this, but he tells a story where they felt like the beginning of the month, they paid off all their month's bills and then gave the rest of their money away. And then they go out to the car and someone had taped a $25 bill to the steering wheel, which of course today would get your windows smashed and stolen, but the spirit is great, right? Someone gave them $25, and he says, based on how much ground beef cost then, we lived like kings for the month. It was awesome. So they trusted God with everything, and God has shown up. I'm not telling you to test God that way. I'm just giving you an example of there are people who do this. They say, I'm going to not give out of my abundance, but out of my lack. I'm going to give as much as I can and see what God does with it. Jesus says things like, talks about the pearl of great price, right? Things like that. We sell everything to get that one thing. He says things like, blessed are the poor and the mourning and the persecuted because they get it. When one of the conversations Jesus had with Peter, he says this, and I want us to try and picture this conversation. This is Jesus looking into the eyes of Peter. Who do you say I am? Put yourself in the place of Peter, right? He's asking you, who do you say I am? Who am I to you? And as he does that, I can feel the space just get silent. Like all the disciples are like, oh. And they probably all, because they're friends, right? So as good friends, they're like, yeah, you're on your own here, Peter. Right? Right, dudes? Like, yeah. That's what we do. Girls will be like, yeah, I want to help. Guys like, see what happens here. See if he gets it right. So Peter is left alone, looking eye to eye with Jesus. Who do you say I am? You're my Messiah. You're our rescuer. You're our hope, our purpose. We have to ask ourselves how much that means to us, what that means to us. And maybe we don't know. And so we give a little bit more. We fast a little bit. We abstain a little bit so we can give a little bit more, free up some time, some money, some other resources so that we have more to give or more room, as we sang, for God to work. Worship team, if you want to come out. Let me be clear. This is not about your failings and how you need to do more. Work harder. Be a better Christian. This is not what this is about. This is about freedom. By practicing the way, we're more in tune with his kingdom, and his kingdom is more fully realized. 1 Peter, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. We are the sojourners and exiles. This is not our home. I urge you to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among those who don't know Jesus, so that when they speak evil of you, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So when they see what God has done, they too will follow Jesus. So when they see that your life that had no purpose now has purpose, they're like, I need some purpose. When they see your life that had no order now has order, they say, I could use some order in my life. When you say, I had no control over this part of my life, but I gave it to Jesus, and now he has control, and I'm a better person, they're like, gosh, I could really use some of that. Right? Or my loved one could really use some of that. See, the world needs hope, and people need to know that the creator of heaven and earth loves them, and these disciplines allow us to be put in a place where God can remind us of who he is and what he's done, and how that can be used to bring more glory, more grace, more peace in North Korea and Ukraine to this world. So as we go to this last song, I just encourage you, can you make a little bit of room? Can you just ask God, I don't know what you want from me, but I want more of you, so just speak to me. Help me to know. Maybe it's you need to fast a little bit. You need to abstain for something. Not necessarily a bad thing, but a good thing. You're going to save up some resources. Maybe it's more of a lifestyle change. I'm going to make a big decision for a year, or maybe it's a decision for a lifetime. You felt God calling you to something different, and now it's time to commit. Let's give space for the Messiah, our rescuer, to continue that work.